In this final video, we're going to talk about how human activities cause imbalances on the nitrogen cycle that can have environmental effects here on Earth. And so some scientists have started referring this as a new era for Earth called the Anthropocene. And as the name suggests, what it means is that humans have a large effect on both atmospheric and geological conditions on Earth. And so this diagram lists a number of different aspects of the environment that humans have had a role in influencing. And so the red line on here indicates that we've had a major effect, and if the color shading goes past the red line, that means we're majorly influencing these certain things. So one aspect you may notice at the top is climate change, and that's often discussed. But some of the most major impact that humans have had on Earth include genetic diversity and also nutrient cycles, including the phosphorus and the nitrogen cycle. And so these two particular biogeochemical cycles are influenced heavily by our agricultural practices, which are necessary to support the population here on Earth. And we'll talk about that more in a second. So first, let's look at the natural and human sources of fixed nitrogen. So one is lightning, which makes it in the atmosphere, which can react nitrogen, dinitrogen dioxide to form nitric oxide or other NOx gases. Bacterial fixation, which we've discussed in earlier videos. But a lot of the fixed nitrogen on Earth comes from industrial nitrogen to make fertilizers or anthropogenic nitrogen. And so this is the Haber-Bosch process that we discussed in an earlier video. And this alone, through the production of ammonia to make fertilizer, supports over 50% of the human population. In other words, without the Haber-Bosch process, we could not support 50% of humans on Earth. So where do these environmental impacts come from? So as we discussed in the previous video, there are different intermediates that come off of the nitrification and denitrification pathways. One of them includes nitrous oxide, which is a potent greenhouse gas that's 300 times has 300 times more of an effect than carbon dioxide. So if we think about this, so remember that the Haber-Bosch cycle supplies a lot of nitrogen in the form of ammonia. And so industrial fixation is on it in addition to the natural sources of fixation. So what that happens is that for industrial fixation, we're in the form of fertilizer, we're adding a lot of ammonia and also nitrate, which is a common component of fertilizers. And so the goal, of course, is to add more nitrogen that goes into assimilatory pathways, which then helps increase our yields of crops, of food crops, so that we can support the human population. But of course, as we know, these also feed in, ammonia and nitrate also feed in to these other pathways, nitrification and denitrification. And so what happens is that nitrous oxide that is produced as a side product or as an intermediate along these pathways is also increased. And so there are other environmental impacts, including what's called eutrophication that we'll discuss in a bit. Greenhouse gas production, as I said, nitrous oxide is a very potent greenhouse gas, and also ground level ozone formation, which occurs from the release of nitric oxide. So how did these get out? So nitrite and nitrate are, as we've discussed before for nitrification, are released from the bacteria as end products of their metabolisms. But where exactly does this nitrous oxide come from? So remember that the bacteria, so we have nitrifiers indicated here on the top and denitrifying bacteria indicated here on the bottom. There are also archaea that are nitrifiers. And so for instance, the nitrifiers take in ammonia and release nitrite for one type of nitrifying bacteria, whereas denitrifiers take in nitrate and release N2.
But remember, there are obligate intermediates on each of these pathways, which means they get released from the enzyme and are taken up by a downstream enzyme and converted to the next product. So these are within the cell. So, for instance, nitrifiers, the obligate intermediates, hydroxylate and nitric oxide are within the cell, and then for denitrifiers, nitrite, nitric oxide, and N2O are made. However, since nitric oxide and nitrous oxide are both gases and potentially volatile, they don't always make it to the next step in the cycle and get converted all the way to the final end products. Instead, some of these gases escape the microbial cells, and then they can be released into the surrounding environment or ultimately into the atmosphere. And so what happens is that nitrous oxide can be released in this way. So bacteria, by taking in more ammonia in the nitrification pathway or nitrate in the denitrification pathway, can ultimately release more N2O as it accidentally escapes from its metabolic pathway. So in this slide, this figure shows the increase in the human population from the year 1000 to 2000 AD. So there starts to be a very large increase in the human population with at the rise of the industrial era, when more efficient farming practices were discovered that allowed for making higher crop yields and allowed for supporting a higher population. Later on, fertilizer, but the Haber-Bosch process in fertilization was also discovered, allowing for this large, rapid increase in the human population. Right along with this increase in the human population was a concomitant increase in the atmospheric nitrous oxide concentration. And so these are well correlated, and this is no accident. About 75% of the nitrous oxide in the atmosphere can be traced to agriculture management. And so again, this has to do with, by increasing the amount of fertilizer, you increase the amount of flux through the nitrification and denitrification pathways, thereby increasing the amount of nitrous oxide that is produced and accidentally escaping from the cells. So in addition to greenhouse gas production, there's also eutrophication, which results from release of nitrite or nitrate. And so eutrophication occurs, is best observed in places like estuaries and lakes, where nitrogen concentrations may be too low to allow for large growth in organisms such as algae. And so when fertilizer is added to the land, occasionally it can go into, for instance, during watering or when there's a rain, these, instead of staying within the soil, these can be carried by the water into rivers and streams, and then ultimately to estuaries or lakes. And so this supplies a new nitrogen source that wasn't there before. And now the organisms that are in those environments now have a new nitrogen buffet, in which it allows for them to grow at a much higher density than they normally would. And this can have large effects. So for instance, this is Lake Okeechobee, a satellite picture of this. And as well known, there are eutrophication leads to formation of algae blooms within the lake, and that has a number of consequences, including decreasing the oxygen concentration of the water, which can ultimately lead to loss of the wildlife within the lake. And this can be a big issue. For instance, if fishing is an important part of the local population for their economy or just for having food. There are also red algae blooms off the coast of Florida. Here's one in southern Florida, which is captured by satellite video, and red algae blooms are toxic, and beaches need to be closed so that people don't get hurt or sent to the hospital because of the toxins that are released by these red algae. And again, that has detrimental health effects for humans as well as economic effects. This can get really substantially large. So this is taken in an area of China where the eutrophication has gotten so wild that it almost looks like there isn't a lake or there isn't a body of water underneath. And this is just simply large growths of algae within this particular body of water, again, caused by eutrophication. And so we can have a lot of effect on these nitrogen cycles through supporting our population, and it is up to us to control these either by creating new methods of controlling eutrophication and nitrous oxide gas emission, either through chemical means or through new agricultural strategies.